We shall see.
Hello.
It's live.
It's live.
Thank you.
Incredible.
Not good.
Where are we?
Awesome.
Dealing with drama. Where are you
Like he's not even gonna stay.
You
Wow.
have firmly embodied
I
the
didn't know that.
best combo. Like, there isn't a North.
So we've got all the bigwigs are here.
All the
Right.
important
Who we
people.
missing? We missing someone? Who we missing?
Not on the committee.
I should have told all my human geo students to come here because this is like perfect, like with my unit on urbanization, and then I
I'm
can just
kind
say,
of glad you didn't.
listen to Ben's thesis, and I don't have to teach this section.
Welcome everyone to day 6 of the Honor Senior Thesis Defenses. Today we have really a heavy emphasis on American government and politics. Anna at 4 o'clock, of course, and Ben here starting in a moment. Topics, again, very timely, very relevant. And again, Ben's been great to work with this year. Anna, both of them just embraced the topics and have done a great job on the research, and really excited to hear their presentations today. Let's give it up for Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Toppich. My name is Benjamin Hopkins, and welcome everyone to my Honors Senior Thesis Defense, Erasing the Red Line, How to Heal the Scars from a Racist Past. I would like to open with a brief overview of some of my most important sources. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein laid the foundation for my understanding of redlining and its history. It was an incredibly formative source for my introductory chapter. Next, I would like to recognize the importance of the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality Project, which contains archived redlining maps of American cities in easily accessible and digestible formats, as seen on this map beside me. Each dot represents a city and its proportion of red line, yellow line, blue line, and green line areas. I also utilized several studies from the Urban Institute in my thesis, particularly in chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. Their work specifies an urban life and development, so it was incredibly helpful in tracking the implications of redlining and giving me ideas on how to solve them. Following Reconstruction, African Americans fled the Jim Crow South in large numbers with the hope of being more accepted in the North. In response to the new influx of Black residents, cities instituted segregationist policies such as redlining in order to preserve a separate white lifestyle in the North. As you can see, these arrows represent major routes of travel of Black families moving out of former slave states into urban areas in the North and West. The Great Depression sent the nation into an unprecedented housing crisis. In order to solve the crisis, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration as part of the New Deal. It also created public housing projects, which were some of the earliest forms of segregated housing in the United States. This example here is Paris Towers in Little Rock. Redlining was first instituted in the 1930s as a result of the New Deal. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration segregated American cities by color-coding maps, systematically denying mortgages to African Americans while giving them away to white Americans. These programs facilitated the white flight to the suburbs and disinvestment from the urban hearts of cities. As you can see, white people often moved into suburbs like this with single-family housing and cul-de-sacs and lawns as this, and the Black families were stuck in slums like this, which are run down, and also in some areas where there's like multi-unit housing like apartments. But they're also just lower quality than the suburbs for white people. As a part of the civil rights movement, large numbers of Americans protested against housing discrimination, saying that true freedom requires full housing equality. It is because of these protests that in 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which prevented housing discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, ethnicity, disability, national origin, and family status. While the Fair Housing Act made redlining illegal, it did nothing to reverse its detrimental effects. The implications of redlining can be effectively separated into economic, social, and political implications. I've dedicated a chapter to detailing each of the three previously mentioned categories and concluded by proposing solutions to each of them in my final chapter. American cities were color-coded by a homeowners loan corporation using the following key. Green is best, blue is still desirable, yellow is definitely declining, and red is hazardous. These classifications were stated to represent economic status, environment, and access to facilities, yet they really corresponded to race. Majority Black neighborhoods were given red classifications, which is where the term redlining derives its name. I chose Little Rock as a primary case study for my thesis because I've lived here my entire life, and I'm familiar with the life in its city, its infamously segregated history, and the distinct visible scars left by redlining. As you can see, the blue and green zones on the map are in the west and north parts of the city where white residents lived at the time. And the red and yellow zones correspond to areas where African Americans lived at the time. And this map is from between 1930 and 1940. As shown on this demographic map from 2010, Little Rock is still a segregated city despite the 55 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed. White people tend to live in the northern and western parts of the city, corresponding to these blue and green zones on the previous map. Black people tend to live in the eastern and southern parts of the city, corresponding to the red and yellow sections on this map. As you can see here, the white and Black populations have remained in the same areas throughout these multiple years. And it's a rigidly segregated city divided by these yellow lines here, which are the interstates. The interstate highway system has an incredibly racist history. In addition to benefiting the white population almost exclusively by facilitating white flight to the suburbs, the locations of interstates were chosen to run along the racial boundaries set by redlining, cementing American cities in rigid segregation. In addition to segregating cities, the interstates were constructed with the concept of slum clearance in mind. The interstates were designed to take the place of undesirable, poor neighborhoods, yet they often targeted prosperous Black communities such as West 9th Street and Little Rock. Slum clearance utilized eminent domain to destroy communities without giving compensation to the residents who were displaced. Another implication of redlining is that schools are still segregated to this day. Today, 66 years after the Central High integration crisis, Little Rock schools are still rigidly segregated. Black students are the majority in every public school in the city of Little Rock itself, while white students are the majority in every private school and every suburban public school. As you can see, schools like Hall, Parkview, Fair, McClellan, and Central are all majority Black, and schools like PA, Catholic, LRCA, Bryant, Cabot, they're all majority white. And PA, believe it or not, is the most racially diverse private school in Little Rock. Schools in Little Rock School District are incredibly underfunded compared to suburban schools because schools are funded by property tax and wealth is mainly concentrated in the suburbs where white people live, which is why schools like Benton, Bryant, Cabot are some of the better funded public schools. Because of the loans given exclusively to white people by the Federal Housing Administration from the 1930s to the 1960s, white families are much more wealthy than Black families on average. As you can see from this chart, even the median wealth of white families in 2016 was well above even the 75th percentile of Black families in 2016, and 10 times that of the median wealth of Black families. That's an incredible disparity between racial wealth. These segregated neighborhoods are remarkably different as well. The typical white suburban neighborhood is characterized by single-unit housing, finely manicured lawns, safe streets, tree coverage, while the typical black neighborhood is urban, made up of multi-unit housing, slightly more run down, and is lacking greenery almost entirely. And as well, black neighborhoods generally have less access to essential services such as education, banking, and grocery stores, which are essential for life. One of the implications of redlining is racial gerrymandering. Gerrymandering uses redistricting to influence election outcomes to favor the incumbent party through packing and cracking. Cracking consists of splitting voters of particular parties into separate districts in order to dilute their voting power. Packing consists of consolidating voters of particular parties into the same district in order to waste their voting power. Racial gerrymandering consists of packing and cracking black neighborhoods into separate districts, and it's been practiced throughout history alongside many other forms of voter disenfranchisement in order to limit black voting power. It would not be possible if American cities were not geographically segregated. In 2020, the Arkansas state legislature split the southern and eastern parts of Little Rock away from the rest of the city, thus cracking the city into diluting the voting power of black Arkansans that live in the southern and eastern parts of Little Rock. As you can see in this graph, southern and eastern parts got split into the southern and eastern districts instead of being in the district that encompasses all of Little Rock. Another obstacle to voting in formerly redlined neighborhoods is poll closure. In recent elections, more and more polling locations have been shutting down due to funding issues and perceived lack of voting interest. This has led to long lines outside of polling locations that often take multiple hours to pass through. This effectively prevents working class people who often do not get much time off work from voting. Additionally, because of the impoverished and crime-conducive conditions of formerly redlined neighborhoods, there are disparities in law enforcement. Police officers often patrol minority neighborhoods much more often than white neighborhoods, leading to many more encounters with police and specifically more police-related fatalities as shown in this chart here. As you can see, despite only being 13% of the population, African Americans make up 31% of all people killed by police and 39% of unarmed people killed by police. Faced with the daunting task of fixing the implications of redlining, we must implement comprehensive solutions to heal racial division and revitalize formerly redlined neighborhoods. The first solution that I outlined in my thesis was economic reinvestment. In order to reverse the disinvestment that occurred alongside white flight, we need to encourage investment in formerly redlined neighborhoods, particularly by providing incentive to banks that would operate in said neighborhoods and meet the credit needs of the people living there. Because right now they're underserved and the majority of lending options available to them are payday lenders, which are incredibly predatory. The second solution I proposed was to institute a completely unbiased housing appraisal process. As shown in this chart, the differences in home and neighborhood quality do not fully explain the devaluation of homes in majority black neighborhoods, meaning that similar quality homes are worth 23% less in black neighborhoods than they would be in white neighborhoods. By providing protections against biases during the appraisal process, equal home valuation can be guaranteed. As discussed earlier with the example of Little Rock schools, schools in minority neighborhoods are underfunded compared to other schools. Nationally, we spend $1,000 less per student in minority districts than in white districts. By expanding school districts to encompass entire cities and their metropolitan areas, the property taxes from the entire city would be used to fund public schools, and schools would not be disproportionately funded. As with the Little Rock example earlier, if we combined the Pulaski County Special School District, which encompasses the suburb schools, And in the Little Rock School District, which encompasses the city schools, then the entire Little Rock metro area would be covered, and then the tax funding from the suburbs would be distributed into the actual city, and the schools would be equally funded. And that would solve some of the education disparity that's so rampant in Little Rock. In order to combat harmful stereotypes and narratives, schools need to teach certain things. Elementary schools need to stress the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as to teach young children simply that racism is bad and diversity is good. In middle and high schools, students need more education on civil rights topics, such as redlining, in order to get a better understanding of race relations, history, and to disprove stereotypes. By making Election Day a national holiday, working class people would have an entire day off work to cast their votes. While this does not stop the root issue of poll closures in formerly redlined neighborhoods, it would give people enough time to vote while simultaneously dramatically increasing voter turnout across the country. So it's a very effective solution. Finally, law enforcement needs radical reform in order to stop police brutality and unequal policing. By increasing the length and rigor of police training, it will be easier to weed out the racist and biased officers. Officers should be required to wear body cameras at all times in order to keep their behavior lawful and hold them accountable. Additionally, both individual officers and police departments need to be held responsible for any abuse of power at the hands of an officer. Thank you so much for listening. Now I'd like to open it for questions.
We'll start with the lost opportunity. Tell us a little bit about what you did interview-wise, and if you were restarting this project in August, it's back in August 2022, what would you do differently as far as trying to integrate interviews in a more constructive way?
So I implemented, I did not implement, but I interviewed Dr. Jay Barth, a professor emeritus at Hendrix, who is currently director of the Clinton Library here in Little Rock. I interviewed him about some possible solutions to redlining early on in the process when I was first formulating ideas. And by the time this was early on in the process, this was maybe in December, and here I am in May defending. I was writing the solutions part in April. And by the time I was writing that solutions part, my ideas had changed, and I didn't end up implementing the ideas I discussed with Dr. Barth. But I think his advice and ideas were very helpful, informative in my process.
Who would you have interviewed, though, if you had the opportunity, you could reach out to someone? What could have made the project better how could it have made it better regarding interviews?
Well, here I had this idea early on in the process about possibly interviewing Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott Jr., but the idea kind of fell through because it was an election year and he was up for re-election. And so he was obviously very busy. I didn't want to bother him in the process, and I wasn't entirely certain that he'd get re-elected. So I didn't really want to interview him if I wasn't certain he'd be the mayor next year, and I didn't want to hurt his chances of winning the re-election.
Who is the driving force behind redlining when it's first implemented? Is this all policymakers, or are there people behind the scenes that are kind of, the puppet masters of this? I mean, where's it stem from?
Well, so it's a mix of both options. So the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation were created as part of the New Deal to try and solve that initial housing crisis. So those were governmental organizations, and the federal government was okay with it, despite it being unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment. State governments were okay with it. Local governments facilitated it. And then banks, realtors, they also collaborated to ensure that Black families looking for homes were only shown homes in Black neighborhoods, and they were completely barred from getting mortgages and even looking at white homes. So they were the main proponents of redlining.
First of all, good job.
Thank you.
I've got 3 questions. That's kind of delving deeper into a couple of things you said. First of all, you talked about the fact that technically these were made illegal in the 60s, these maps, but we're still seeing the impacts. Do you find any interesting excuses or justifications for why we shouldn't go back and look at these maps? Why is this still continuing to be an issue, even though it's an obvious issue? Why are people ignoring this?
Well, for one, it's not commonly taught in schools, so people aren't really exactly familiar with the history and the unjust circumstances that the government from the past has put minorities into in these neighborhoods. So people aren't entirely sure that those maps even exist. So they just think this happened for like some natural reason. So they don't know that there is an issue to fix. They think that this is due to the fault of the people that are in this situation, even though it is through no fault of their own.
You talked about as your first recommendation as a reinvestment in these communities. Other than the handful of federal loan programs, most home loans and other community loans are done through private businesses. Did you see any programs to try to entice private businesses to actually get engaged in this? How would you get a private group to want to take these steps?
I didn't actually come across that in my research, but I would think that similar to how the incentives we would give to banks, being like, I don't know, like tax breaks, stipends, something like that. And to give to banks, we would also give to private organizations to help conduct business in Black neighborhoods, like in order to ensure that grocery stores operate in minority neighborhoods, because right now there's similarly a need for grocery stores as there is for banks.
And final question, you talked about education being essential to this, is spreading the diversity and social education. Looking at modern trends in politics and education, do you see any roadblocks to this expanding diversity education?
I definitely see many roadblocks. And like, for example, in Florida, there's many different pushbacks against diversity, equity, and inclusion being taught in schools, both by the government and from constituents in Florida. But although this is not only limited to Florida, this is limited to, like, it's generally coming from conservatives across the country, not from everyone, but from like non-moderates, or people further right, but coming from like farther out right places like that. Not alt-right, but I don't know how to touch. You
Yeah.
get what I say.
Thank you.
I have a question that piggybacks a little bit. There was such an emphasis in this presentation, and I love that it was, of our community, our city. As we kind of, now you're at the end of it, we're looking at it this way. Did you find any implications for our school? If our spheres of influence, right, are fairly limited, but this is a place where we could get things started. Were there any solutions that could begin here?
Well, definitely the parts where we talk about what needs to be taught in schools. I know in human geography this year we learned about redlining, and we also took a field trip recently to Little Rock and saw some of the effects firsthand. But I would say that needs to happen earlier in high school, not just in our last year, right before we're about to leave for college. Like when we live in a city like Little Rock, people need to be encouraged to look around, see the effects of what happened, why they happened. I feel like that needs to happen early on while we're still living here and not right before we're about to leave.
Yeah. My only other question was, were there any other example cities in the country? Of course, this wasn't limited to Little Rock. So were there any other cities in the country where they have begun to take strides in reinvesting?
Ooh.
Or in any of the solutions that you posed?
Huh. Well, I don't know entirely. I haven't looked. I was mainly trying to look and see how to apply these solutions to Little Rock and then push them out further in the country. But I can't think of any specific cities, but like I'm sure there's programs in like big cities like New York, Chicago, LA that are trying to reinvest in some cities. They're like gentrification, but also that can also be harmful because it raises the rent for the people already living there. But yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Great job, Ben.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to hit that gentrification issue a little bit harder. And, you know, I love this idea, of course, of revitalizing these neglected areas. But of course, often that results in sometimes the unintended consequences of further marginalizing or pushing populations out to the periphery when they can no longer afford rent there. What kind of solution do you think would help to kind of balance that out?
I think the solution that I came across was instituting maximum rent increases per year. That way, people already living in these neighborhoods that get gentrified, while they are living in a nicer community, they don't have to pay more for it because they can't afford it, and they're not getting pushed out to the periphery, as you had stated. I think that would prevent mass eviction crises that would result from mass gentrification.
And while you were doing your research, did you read anything about the topic of like environmental justice or environmental racism, and how does that play into these redlined areas?
I definitely did. My second chapter, or my third chapter actually, has a large section about environmental disparities, where, as I mentioned earlier, white suburban neighborhoods have a ton of green space and tree coverage, while black neighborhoods are devoid of green space and greenery entirely, almost. This, like, because of like shade and stuff, white neighborhoods are on average cooler than black neighborhoods that are like mostly concrete, because concrete radiates heat more easily and trees take it away. But also how in minority communities, some of them were zoned as industrial districts, which means that there were factories put next to where people were living, meaning that pollution and runoff and other like smog from factories was infiltrating where people live and causing negative health effects.
Good.
Thank you.
Could you elaborate a little bit briefly before I open it up to the audience on how this impacted education? I'm specifically talking about when the lawsuit in the 80s led to Little Rock School District gaining some of the schools, 1987 to be exact, that were part of the county and vice versa, to create this disparity, and how that may or may not have had a positive impact because the connection to white flight and everything is so significant with that, and the rise of communities like Benton and Bryan, Conway, Cabot, etc.
So I did do research on that. In Little Rock specifically, white flight was a result of the integration crisis and black students integrating into white-dominated public schools in the city. So white people, they feared their children going to school with black students, so they fled to the suburbs and founded cities like Cabot, Benton, Bryan, Conway, places like that. And the public schools over there became majority white, while the schools in Little Rock itself became majority black. And Little Rock became split between the Little Rock School District and the Pulaski County Special School District. And the Pulaski County Special School District included all of the suburbs, and then this tiny portion of Little Rock on the west, where all of suburban rich white people lived. So their school was zoned differently. And then in the 1980s, there was a lawsuit, a desegregation lawsuit, because the schools were so segregated and they were funded so disproportionately. All of the money was concentrated in the Pulaski County Special School District and almost none of it in the Little Rock School District. And there's a lawsuit that swapped some schools over from Pulaski County Special School District into Little Rock itself. And there were also programs like citywide busing that allowed schools or students to transfer to any other school in the Little Rock School District as long as they would be a minority in that new school. However, that system it didn't really, it's still in place today, but it didn't really heal the problems of segregation because every student in the Little Rock School District, or every school in the Little Rock School District is majority Black. So it only helps students of other races, which is partially why Central High, the best school in the district, is the most racially diverse because everyone else is transferring to Central High to get the best opportunity for education.
Let me ask one more question. You talk very briefly about, in real estate, the varying kind of appraisals that you might see for, say, the same house in different neighborhoods. But during this time of really, rapid home ownership, especially in the post-World War II era, we had these policies that allowed for, racial covenants and things like that. What role did the real estate agents play in really kind of pushing this era of white flight?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were disparities in like which houses and neighborhoods realtors would show to people of certain races. So white families would be shown houses in rich suburbs where they could move into, get a loan, and then make a new life there. And then Black families were shown apartments in the inner city or in special Black designated housing areas, which quickly became disinvested and neglected by the government.
Audience questions?
Okay, Ms. Birch?
So you talked a little bit about how the interstates were built intentionally to support racial biases and practices. Have you looked much at like 21st century urban development and like city planning and how people who are on boards are making decisions for roads and parks and green spaces and things like that are trying to reverse some of these things? I have a former student she's not like 40, but from Hockaday, who has worked with the city of San Antonio, and that was like their whole focus was trying to like make decisions in city planning that can reverse some of the previous racist practices.
I know there is a decently sized push for that because people more recently have been trending away from car-centric cities and stuff, and part of that is getting rid of the interstates, which alongside their racist history does not help the case with interstates remaining here. But I know in Little Rock specifically, I came across this project a few months ago, but they're getting rid of like an exit on the interstate on the River Market, I think, and they're replacing it with the city park, which would help with green space in the city and downtown, which that's an example in Little Rock, but I know other cities, I'm pretty sure they're taking more, they're taking similar stances, although in Little Rock, we have a very, very strong tie with the interstate since we're the junction of two of the biggest interstates in the country. So they're probably not going anywhere for a while, but we can try to maybe more effectively integrate them into the city. Josh.
Which of the solutions that you researched did you find to be most effective / like most important to combating?
Definitely, it would be school funding equality, because education is one of the most accurate predictors of success. So by having equally funded schools, everyone has an equal opportunity to success. But right as it stands now, minority students have less chances for success as compared to white students, and suburban schools like Benton, they probably have a better chance than someone from Hall, just for example. But definitely school funding. Okay, Rhett.
Your thesis in the defense mentions a lot about urban areas, obviously, because it's more prevalent in your lens of political, economic, social. But is there any redlining in more rural areas? Is that a phenomenon that you've come across in your research?
Well, so not really. I'm gonna flip back to the map from the University of Richmond to kind of help a little bit. But this would help me explain it some more. I have to go back a long way. Okay, here we are. As you can see, it's just the biggest cities, really. Like when they created the map, the homeowners loan corporation, they probably don't care enough to like make a map for a small city in rural Arkansas as they do for like a big city like Kansas City here. So it was more for like cities than rural areas.
I see.
Mm-hmm. It's not to say rural areas weren't neglected, because over the years you can clearly see decline in rural life. I just don't think it's related to redlining. Anyone else? Josh again.
What inspired you to choose this topic?
Oh, this is an interesting story. So in Mr. Giles' 11th grade English class, we read A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, which follows a story of the Younger family who attempted to buy a home in a white neighborhood in 1950 segregated Chicago. And they went through many struggles, including facing a restrictive covenant, death threats, paying an exorbitant price for the house, yet they still bought it because that was their dream home. So that was my story. I ended up writing a research paper on redlining last year for English class, and I researched the history of it, and I wanted to go more in depth into it, so that I wanted to find solutions to it. So that's why I wrote my whole thesis on it.
Are you saying those two are part of the work agenda? Or they're at the end of the table?
Sure.
We're being filmed.
You're not on camera.
Good job, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great job, Ben. Oh, committee members, is there a photo at all? So King, Ben, hold on, Ben. Ben,
Couple times.
Ben, get on this side. Yeah. And then,
Well, I don't want to have that.
Yeah, hold on.
Thank
Go to
you.
the first one. Right, that's it.
Don't want to wrap it up.
All right, okay, Ben. You want to get over here so you're not blocking it. We've been splitting them. Okay, ready?
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh. If I did that on purpose.
I don't think it was. Because he did it.
Yeah. Okay.
What did I do?
That was it. We got the good photo.
So what do I? The good photos when you're not around.
Josh, tell that group to come on in. Everyone waiting in the hallway.
Rate the outfit out of 10.
Well, I'm not waiting. I've got to.
Oh, you have to be unbiased.
I mean,
Hey, what did I do?
the colors, amazing.
It was on purpose.
I 10 out of 10.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I appreciate that.
Then again, I'm not sure, I know why you want to listen to Clearly, Mr. John's forte. Yeah.
All right. All set? I don't think enough people have logged in. I did not want
It's like faded at the same time.
It looks good. I mean, it's hard to do that well. Anna, do you need this?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
That's my grandma, by the way.
Yeah, she was.
Did you introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, good, good. Well,
I appreciate that you just walked.
Oh, we got Lake here. Up to 10 minutes. Wow. Okay, I thought about it.
You're applying for 24-hour news.
am I applying for 24-hour news?
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Actually, yes. Patriotic.
Adam, I moved it to that's good.
Wow.
We're on the arm.
Then you feel good? Never.
Kind of.
You're done?
And,
Yeah?
this was a.
Wait. Maybe I'll like move my computer so I can just.
Got it, right?
Got it.
Camera angle okay?
Maya says she wants it.
Okay. Welcome everyone to day number 6 in our 12th honors thesis defense. Anna Abston, of course, has taken a theme that has been a common narrative in the last 6 or 7 years to look at the declining trust in political decline in America. We had Ahad Nadeem, Jake Rogers last year that have explored aspects of this theme. And Anna, I'll be honest, not to brag on her, but I think has really taken it to the next level. Excellent job throughout the year. And I will say of all 22 students in thesis this year, really engaged with the committee, always, really taking in the idea of making the project better and improving the project and taking the constructive criticism. So, and she's going to have a phenomenal career down the road, I think, in the realm of maybe law or political science. And again, this is hopefully one of the early stepping stones to that. Let's give it up at this point to Anna Abston.
Thank you, Mr. Talbot. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Abston, and today I will be presenting my honors senior thesis defense titled United We Stand, Divided We Fall, The Political Implications of Declining Trust in the American Government. The ultimate purpose of my thesis was to uncover the primary reasons for the decline of public trust in the government, analyze how this lack of trust has caused political polarization and identity politics, and provide a policy recommendation based on my research that I believe these issues can be addressed within the system. I'd first like to introduce a few sources that were essential to crafting my argument. The Upswing by Robert Putnam was one of the first books that I consulted on my research journey. This book attributes the divided state of politics that we see today to many events that happened in the late 20th century, as does my thesis. Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein also proved instrumental to my research. Klein argues that the current state of American politics can be attributed to identity politics and group mentality. In addition, Why We're Polarized was essential to crafting my policy recommendation chapter. In order to gather data, I also utilized many political science studies, mainly sourced from the digital library JSTOR. Utilizing these studies was necessary in order to reinforce my central claims. I also had the opportunity of interviewing Dr. Jay Barth and Dr. Janine Perry, both experts in the field of political science. Their wisdom and willingness to assist allowed me to have insightful conversations and expanded my knowledge of the topic beyond just words on a page.
For the purposes of this thesis, the term virtue is defined as exhibiting high moral standards and subordinating one's individual desires in favor of the greater good. As a self-proclaimed democracy, America has an obligation to uphold virtue. Ultimately, the success of democracy depends on virtuous sentiment by both the legislators and the people, allowing for healthy dissonance and reasonable governance. It is also vital to differentiate between American skepticism and cynicism in regards to beliefs about the government. The necessity for social and political trust in American democracy is evident. However, it is negligent to not address the fact that small amounts of political skepticism are beneficial to any democracy. Skepticism holds politicians accountable and encourages constituents to vote based on their own ideas, rather than aligning themselves with a certain politician or party. This skepticism becomes dangerous, however, when it manifests itself into cynicism. Cynicism hinders the government's ability to deal with key problems by causing negative, destructive, and unwavering politics, an issue that we face today. The Pew Research Center has been tracking American public trust in the government since 1958. Trends have illustrated a pretty constant decline. In 1965, the percentage of constituents who said they trusted the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time was at an all-time high, 77%. Now, we see it has dropped in 2022 to only 20%. By first identifying general characteristics that lead to success and trust in democracy, it is easier to discern what has caused trust in democracy to erode over time. Ultimately, I found that it depends on tolerance, citizenry participation in democratic processes, respect for the rule of law, and strong leadership. The importance of these four aspects of democracy cannot be understated. The system has seen a marked deterioration of all four of these pillars, causing the political turmoil that we see today. For time purposes, I will not be able to delve into all four of these as I did in my thesis. However, I find it necessary to define tolerance. Disagreement is a constant and inescapable feature of American politics, but how that disagreement is approached and resolved over time is not constant across American history. Tolerance refers to the willingness of either party to cooperate with the other. The more tolerant politicians are, the more politically unified and productive the country will be. So we know what American democracy needs to succeed, but a multitude of factors have hindered the ability of American politics to function effectively today. My studies led me to conclude that historically, when faced with international crises, America has been able to domestically unify and in order to be able to tackle these outside threats. A prime example of this would be the Cold War and the American democratic quest to triumph over communism. In fact, the country was so unified that in the 1950s, political scientists began to worry about the extent to which political collaboration was taking place. This led to the writing of Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System, a report published by the American Political Science Association that called for more polarized politics and addressed ways to facilitate this. My research led me to understand that political fragmentation began in the 1970s with the increased exposure of scandals in the media. Depicted by Putnam's I-We-I curve, introduced in the upswing, the upside-down U-shape is a visual representation of the intersectionality of economics, politics, society, and culture, and how they have been influenced over time by primarily domestic affairs. As we can see, all four of these factors correlate, peaking in the 1960s and beginning to decline starting in the 1970s. Scandal morphs the public perception of politics in two main ways. First, it erodes perceived legitimacy of the government by exposing the failings of the government and politics, and knowledge of scandal exacerbates American skepticism to a point that becomes cynical. In the second chapter of my thesis, I focused on three scandals: the publishing of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, the Watergate scandal from 1972 to 1974, and the Iran-Contra affair in the early to mid-1980s. A study was conducted in 1967 by the US government that evaluated the country's role in the Vietnam War. The study ultimately concluded that the public had been kept in the dark about the war and that the US had no valid reason for continuing to fight. The papers were then leaked to the New York Times, where the public felt betrayed. They had been told that only communists would withhold information from their citizens and disillusion them, but now they had glaring proof that the US government had done this as well. This was the first instance of widespread public distrust, as citizens became blatantly aware of the government's moral failings in Vietnam. On June 17, 1972, only 1 year after the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the public, 5 criminals carrying sophisticated technology infiltrated the Democratic National Committee's office located in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. President Nixon worked quickly and closely with a few of his aides to cover up the break-in, winning the 1972 election in a landslide. However, as a legislative committee further investigated these crimes, they traced it back to the Nixon administration. Exposure of the Watergate scandal represents the most blatant turning point in history for citizenry doubt of the government. The candor and integrity of the entire Nixon administration was called into question. According to a study published by 2 political scientists at Washington State University, bonds to the government are synonymous with favorable feelings towards it. And between 1973 and 1974, bonds to the executive branch dropped by 20%, and bonds to all government leaders dropped by 11%. Additionally, Nixon's approval ratings dropped 14 points from late January to late April 1973, and Nixon was even criticized by his own ideological allies and supporters. Third, the Iran-Contra affair was a fascinating case study. Essentially, Congress had strictly prohibited the U.S. government from aiding democratic rebels in socialist Nicaragua, whether directly or indirectly. However, President Reagan blatantly disregarded the rule of law and sold arms to Iran in exchange for American hostages who were being held in Lebanon. He funneled the difference to the rebels in Nicaragua, called the Contras. Very soon, news of the scandal was leaked, and Reagan took to national television to address the issue. He admitted to the validity of selling the arms for hostages. However, he firmly stated that he had not known about the diversion of funds to the Contras, a fact that we still don't know if that's true today. The initial response from the public was incredibly negative. Support for Reagan plummeted, seeing as a key part of his rhetoric was his promise to never engage with a terrorist state. Reagan and his administration lost a vast amount of credibility, and the public questioned whether or not Reagan was capable of presiding, as he had proved himself to be unaware of the matters of his own administration. The evolution of media is another factor that perpetuates the decline of trust. Technological advancement, the rise of investigative journalism, and the 24-hour news media cycle are the most prominent examples of the way that media has increased the coverage of scandal. Amidst the challenges of the mid-20th century in America, the press became extremely focused on unearthing any presidential discrepancies. Illegalities in politics have always been present within the system. However, an increase in investigative journalism has allowed the public to become increasingly aware of these illegalities. Political scientist Jürgen Mayer stated in a study, "Only if abuses are brought to the attention of the public by the media can they turn into scandals." Mass media giants have likewise perpetuated a lack of equal coverage and viewpoint diversity in televised news. This phenomenon is a positive feedback loop. The more slanted the reporting, the more people tune in, which increases the revenue of these corporations, making the reporting more one-sided. The public now demands immediate, up-to-date news, perpetuated within the 24-hour news cycle. Beginning in the 1980s, televised journalists started to search for stories to fill the excessive amount of time that they were being given on air. This demand for speed can also hinder journalists from obtaining all of the facts about a story before publishing it, leading to false news. The media evidently plays a fundamental role in politics in America, affecting politicians, their reputation, the exposure and perception of scandal, and public opinion. As evidenced by this graph, political polarization has dramatically increased from 1994 and on. Now we transition into the effects of declining trust. As citizens become extremely cynical towards the American government, this has caused political polarization. Polarization, in turn, causes decreased government productivity, increases the phenomenon of identity politics, and allows for media divisiveness. Polarization has caused decreased government productivity because it makes legislators less tolerant. This renders the legislative branch virtually incapable of passing legislation, especially in the Senate, where the use of the filibuster has increased exponentially in the past 12 years, more than it ever has been used in history. Due to high levels of gridlock in Congress, the branch is unable to fulfill their role in overseeing the executive branch. This lack of checks and balances has enabled the president to sign executive orders rapidly and sometimes with a very low degree of accountability. The country has experienced a rapid increase in the enactment of executive orders throughout the past century, and its perceived need for executive orders allows for corruption of power. Due to legislative gridlock and the rising use of executive orders, Americans no longer feel that their interests are properly represented by virtuous politicians. This has resulted in less citizenry participation in democratic processes. There is a significant decrease in the amount of people showing up to vote due to widespread allegations of voter fraud and election deceit. Likewise, data spanning from 1998 to 2013 reveals that U.S. cable news networks have become significantly more polarized, mostly due to economic gain. Easy access to polarizing channels causes the reinforcement of staunch political opinions. Biased reporting provides an easily digestible version of an otherwise confusing political world for many citizens who want to be politically involved. Research conducted by political scientist Matthew S. Lewandowski found that as citizens are fed opinions that closely align with their own, they become progressively intolerant of the other party. Political polarization has likewise caused the intertwinement of social and political identity, called identity politics. Klein puts it this way: living in a city, being a liberal, shopping at Trader Joe's, and dabbling in Zen meditation may not have much to do with another in terms of public policy, but they reinforce a singular identity, and that identity is political, or at least easily politicized. Our current polarized political climate also pushes moderate voters to the margins, significantly reducing their influence. Nowadays, if politicians are able to appeal to a specific extreme group of voters, they are able to gain that group of voters unwavering support, and that's how they win elections. For example, former President Trump was able to mobilize his most radical supporters to attack the Capitol on January 6th when he claimed that there had been widespread voter fraud after he had lost the 2020 election. Both parties must acknowledge the fact that there is disunity and animosity among the electorate. Then these problems can be properly identified with bipartisan support. The first reform that I proposed in my thesis was systemic reform, which can be broken down into two subcategories: reaffirming election security and changing institutional structures. Reaffirming election security is necessary so that people can feel more confident that their vote matters. One example of this is Rescue in Colorado, or Rapid Response Election Security Cyber Units. These are teams of people who work to combat attacks on election infrastructure and cyber hostility. Colorado continues to lead the nation in cybersecurity, allowing their population to feel confident that their vote will be safely tallied. In terms of actual institutional change, a better system of checks and balances is necessary. Enhancing congressional staff capacity is a proposed solution for this. Providing committees with the resources to hire more staff, as well as training those staff to be effective overseers of the executive branch, can increase the efficiency of both Congress and the executive branch. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington is a nonprofit watchdog organization that oversees the government, specifically founded to manage issues such as the ones I'm addressing. Noah Bookbinder, the president of this operation, states that the people are entitled to know what is going on behind closed doors, especially in a government that dubs itself democratic. He encourages transparency that reveals not only the shortcomings of government, but also the strengths. This way, the public can vote in ways that will address these shortcomings, but the politicians who are acting ethically and virtuously can be praised. Civic education is the most viable option to resolving this issue because it is proactive rather than reactive. This includes not only rectifying systems that perpetuate polarization, but also empowering citizens' political voices and encouraging the growth of social relationships. A stronger emphasis on civic education in schools nationwide has the potential to heighten social capital and mobilize voters, simultaneously promoting healthy competition and individual ideology. Similarly, community involvement and activism among students can translate to higher civic engagement. Media literacy skills are equally important, defined by the Center for Media Literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. Media literacy teaches people to form their own independent opinions. Teaching media literacy skills in middle and high school as a part of civic education can dramatically assist in voter education, and it has been proven by studies to do so. No matter how the government decides to intervene, its top priority should be protecting American media's freedom of speech, a vital feature of democratic government. As long as freedom of speech is protected, the government can and should incentivize media companies to report more neutrally through the passage of legislation and other proposals. Currently, bipartisan legislation is being constructed in the Senate to decrease the influence of media monopolies and give small and medium-sized media corporations a chance to thrive in the corporate world, thus giving consumers more options. In addition, the public can turn to local news rather than relying solely on national news. This invokes a sense of belonging and inspires people to get involved with their local community. It's easy to feel distance from federal issues, leading to a lack of political participation. By educating themselves on local news, people can feel connected to politics much easier. This leads to political empowerment in local communities. The value of virtue in American democracy cannot be understated. The country must work to reignite American citizens and politicians' belief in the possibility of change. Referring to when he worked in the White House, Noah Bookbinder claimed, "I saw there was constant press about all the awful things happening in Congress. What I saw day in and day out was primarily really smart, really well-intentioned people working incredibly hard to try to make life better for all Americans." As politicians work to uphold truth and improve the lives of citizens, this should encourage Americans. It should reassure them that the country has enormous potential to once again be at the forefront of exemplary democratic governance, if only the country decides to work in a unitary effort to confront these pressing dilemmas. Thank you.
Let's go back to Mr. Putnam for a minute. Did you see any connection between the decline of social capital? I know you referenced Bowling Alone.
I did read that as well.
As well as some of his later works like Upswing, but the connection between social capital's decline, especially in the particular decades you outlined, how important was the social capital towards the findings you had in the thesis?
Well, first, I didn't get to address this in my defense, so I'm glad you asked. I think the most important thing about social capital is, for anyone who doesn't know, Robert Putnam, I believe he coined the term social capital. And it's essentially the ability of communities to come together, regardless of politics, and be able to sort of just build these social relationships. I found that so the Upswing, so I read Bowling Alone first. And I found that a lot of the ideas that he was presenting in Bowling Alone, which was more about social capital, carried over into the Upswing. And so I think that was one of his main points, I think, and that's why I showed the I curve. One of his main points was that was because of the decline of social capital. There was a quote that he said that was something like, "Americans have replaced the American Legion and the Rotary Club with Twitter and Instagram." So it's like, I think that kind of speaks to the rise of media as well, in that sense of that's how trust has declined. Being able to engage with people socially, regardless of political beliefs, was something that he introduced, and that was really important to my topic.
What other scandals, if there would have been another scandal you could have included, or maybe even tell the audience how and why you decided to go with the 3 scandals that you used as case studies?
In regards to another one I could have included, whenever we first talked about, so my thesis was originally going to be 6 chapters, and it was originally going to be an introduction, and then each chapter was going to be dedicated, the next 4 chapters are going to be dedicated to political scandals. And I was going to talk about all 3 of these, and then the Whitewater scandal. Yeah. And so I would say that one, I believe, was in the 90s. And I think if I could have included one more, it would have been that one. But I wanted to be able to delve more into the 3 that I had chosen. And I kind of just let my research guide me there. And that's why I ended up with the 3 that I did choose. That's what my research was pointing to.
They limit how many questions I can ask. So. First question,
Yes.
how many minutes on average were you able to go without having Bill Toppich ask you about Robert Putnam? or social
You know, I
capital
actually
theory?
tried to contact him for an interview. He didn't get back to me.
Oh,
I was surprised.
hey, didn't
I
hear
figured
from
he'd be
him.
really, really anxious to help out with a high school.
I
high school
mean,
project.
what else does he
Yeah,
have going
he
on?
spoke to our classes before, yeah.
Well, I know. I even mentioned your name in the interview, or in my whenever I was like emailing him to reach out. I was like, "I'm Mr. Topich's student," thinking that would help, but it
I
didn't.
like this. You talked about election security, and the need to increase it. You look at Colorado's example. Looking back, historically, our elections have been fairly secure at the national level, in comparison to other nations. And in fact, in 2020, it was ranked as, at least as far as digital security, as one of the high security elections we've ever had. And yet the rhetoric does not match that. How do you combat the reality versus the rhetoric when it comes to faith in elections? Or did you find anything on those?
Yeah. I think that I used Trump's incitement of January 6th as an example. But I think that the fact that voters are identifying themselves with a certain politician is the most dangerous thing, because if you're identifying yourself with a certain politician, you're just going to hang on to every word that they say. And that's especially true with Donald Trump, because he's essentially a populist. And so he's, everything he says, he's able to mobilize his supporters in that way. So I think going past just election security, I think the root of the issue is people identifying themselves with a certain politician and hanging on to every word that they say.
This is kind of branching off of that. You talked about the need to regain faith in elections, and you heavily put this at the feet of the media. And this wasn't specifically the focus of your thesis, but you're incredibly well read. Have you come across things like what we can do about gerrymandering, the influence of campaign finance? Are these self-perpetuating? Are these self-reinforcing? Or can we just address the media and the security and it's good?
No, I think any way that we can address it is important. And I did talk about gerrymandering briefly in my thesis. I think it's included in my defense. But I think the most important way that we can address this is starting with civic education, because I don't think it's at the top of government's priority list, because they're benefiting from the system.
I got
So
one
yeah.
final,
Go
and
for
there's, Ms. Beard's jumping a bit and gonna punch me here in a second, but,
Yes.
so we let the genie out of the bottle with social media and this easily accessible deluge of sources. Looking back at your research, is there anyone or any government or any policy specifically that you think would actually help curb this trend towards overstimulation, perhaps? Or
I don't know about policies that are being enacted right now. I know that, well, I do know there was an election security reform that I included in my thesis. I'm blanking on the name of it now, but it was back in January, actually. And it was meant to oversee the translation of votes from, where they start in for national elections, and their passage to DC to get, or wherever they're going to get counted. There have been small reforms, like I think after a scandal, that's when the reforms happen. So after Watergate, there was a Sunshine Act, which was supposed to make congressional committees public. But there were still, people were back and forth on that. And so I was honestly surprised that the Sunshine Act even got passed, but I think it was because Watergate had just happened. And so I think when a scandal that big is happening, that's when people are going to be mobilized to do something about it.
My turn. Okay, so schools have become a really key battleground in the culture wars of the 21st century. And the concept of virtue is no longer a neutral term. What role or how should schools seek to develop virtue in students, given that reality?
I think civic education is so important because it's not supposed to be partisan. it's just supposed to teach students, or anyone really, how to form their own political opinions. And so I think that's the most important part, is knowing, when you're educating someone, it goes for educators, it goes for students, learning that it's not supposed to be a hostile environment. And I think, reverting virtue to that, neutral definition of upholding what America is supposed to stand for, which is, honesty and truth. I think that's the most important part of civic education.
Okay. What do I want to ask? Because that was what I was going to ask. Is, trying to recommend for us what we could do as a school community to educate not only kids, but also their families, that we're not trying to indoctrinate and that we're trying to do that kind of stuff. So that's a really good point. Topic said earlier before you started that this is something that's been covered, the last 7 years in some way, shape, or form. And it really is, because it continues evolving. So I am curious if what you see happening, like with Clarence Thomas' Supreme Court scandal right now, do you think that there is a way back, especially when we're supposed to trust the court, how they can gain that back? Because it seems like for a long time, maybe 2 of our 3 branches of government were not very trusted, and now it's looking like a 3rd one's coming down the line. So is there anything that we can do to maybe gain that back?
I think I focused on the Congress and the executive branch the most, because that's where the most divisiveness, I guess, has occurred, and there's been a deterioration of checks and balances there. But I think you bring up a good point with the judiciary, and I think all it does is just make citizens feel like their government is, representing them less and less. In terms of what we can, where we might go in the future, again, I want to go back to civic education, because it's so important, because it's preventative from, and also media. And I don't know if there's any viable solution to that, because, these mass media corporations have grown so big. I don't know if you know about the Fox Dominion lawsuit with voter fraud and Dominion systems. I know that's caused a lot of implications now, but I think the important part about this topic is that it is ever changing and ever evolving. But as long as people, go back to the roots of the issue and the cause of the issue, which is we need to uphold virtuous politics. I think that's the most important part. Yes.
Great job, Anna. I know this is a government and politics topic, but there's a lot of human geo wrapped up in this. And I'm wondering if you can explain, maybe the role of the urban-rural divide or changing demographics in the United States, how those play a role in some of our polarization today.
I so wish I had looked at that more, and I wish I had more time to delve into that. Obviously we know that, more rural places are going to lean more conservatively, and more urban places are going to lean more liberally. And I don't exactly know what America's changing demographics are looking like right now. I would assume more people are moving into cities. I know New York's growing like exponentially, but I think, I hate to bring COVID into this, but, I don't know if that changed the urban-rural divide at all, but having conglomerates of places that they're really liberal, and then you have places that are Republican, that also plays into, gerrymandering in districts like that. So I don't know. Sadly, I didn't delve into that as much as I wanted to. But yeah.
We recently watched a TED Talk in Human Geo about the danger of a single story. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that and how that kind of relates to this idea of polarization as well.
Well, what I remember from that TED Talk is that the girl who was giving it was basically like having a stereotypical view of something, or spreading only one narrative or one side of the story is detrimental to anything. And I think that can especially apply to politics, because, when you have politicians that are supposed to be representing these people and they're, only keeping only spreading one side of the story, that can definitely impact politics. So I think when you think about it that way, and you think about the impact that politicians have on their constituents, that is really important. And so I think whatever way we might do this, trying to influence or incentivize politicians to be more neutral, and I mean not more neutral because they have to represent their party, but being able to, be more honest and open with their constituents is important.
Audience questions?
Yes, Charlotte.
So what would you say to the cynic that says that our government's not trustworthy, we have the worst government in the world,
You
and
say
America's just going downhill, and in the future always sees political corruption, and there's no hope?
Do you say the Senate?
The cynic, not the
Oh,
cynic.
I thought you said the Senate.
No.
I don't know. That's difficult because I think once someone goes so far down that path, it's like, I looked at a lot of statistics that was like, it's hard to come back from that. I think that's a difficult person to encounter, but I think, because honestly, if someone is being that cynical, or if someone has, their political beliefs and they're so far, it makes it even worse to talk about it with someone. It's what I found. But I think being able to have those conversations is important no matter what. So, yes, Miss Lacey.
What can we do to encourage young folks like you and others to run for office and be leaders in the future?
Good question. I think being knowledgeable about the topic is important because if people don't know about it, they're not going to do anything about it. So I think, government's a really important class, but like even just a specifically civics education class, because, government, you cover all kinds of topics, and Mr. Simmons' class is even government and economics as well. But having a civic education class and inspiring people to get involved that way, I think it starts that way. And also like local empowerment, like I talked about, community involvement is really important. Volunteering and things like that. If you're out in your community and you're seeing these issues, that's what's going to make you really empowered and really want to make a change. And I think that starts with running for office. Yes, Mr. Hagan.
Going forward, how are you going to use your research in your life?
Well, I want to major in political science, hopefully going to law school, and I want to study constitutional law. So, interpret especially the Bill of Rights, and so the rights. And I talked about freedom of speech in the media. Freedom of speech in the media. That's something that's really important to me is preserving citizens' rights. And so I think this topic has really just provided me with a jumping off point in this project, and it's been really impactful for me. Yes, Lake.
So do you see these kind of increasing number of scandals leaning more into corruption, kind of that positive feedback loop kind of way, or do you see it more increasing pushes for direct democracy and referendums and things like that at the state level?
Well, wait, can you repeat the first part of your question again?
Oh yeah, do you see the increasing number of scandals and things like that in American politics? Is that feeding into corruption, or is that more reform?
I wish I could say it was instituting reform, but I think the more that people find out that their politicians are not doing what they believe they were doing or what they were told that they were doing, I think that, like I talked about, after Watergate and after all of these scandals happen, that's when reforms are instituted by lawmakers. But in terms of constituents, I think it only makes them more cynical because they're especially someone that they're close with, or a politician that, they're really wow, this person's great. And then they figure out something. I think it just makes them more cynical. And I hate to be a cynic myself, but yeah. Yes, Ms. Shayla.
Great job, Anna.
Thank you.
I was just curious if in your research, did you come across any correlation between length of service, Congress, Senate, and decrease or increase in tolerance as described in the
That's an interesting question. And I actually didn't, but there was a quote that I came across of a legislator who said that essentially you have to decide if you're going to be a constructive or a destructive factor in the democratic process. So if you're going to be willing to cooperate with others and be tolerant in that way, versus if you're just going to be this is what I want, this is what my party wants, this is what my constituency wants. I think the most important part is cooperation. So I don't necessarily know about term length that correlates with that, but I would say obviously the more, the longer someone serves a term, the more experience they're going to be and the more vocal they might be about their policies and representing their constituents.
Here, did you have another one? I thought you were chomping at the bit. Did you have another
Well,
one?
I have one more.
Go ahead, go
Go-
for
go
it.
for
Let's do it.
Okay, if virtue is about subordinating your own desires for the
Yes.
greater good, how do we convince marginalized people that this is a worthwhile endeavor?
You mean like low income communities or
I
or
mean,
marginalized demographics in general?
I mean that we like to look back at that mid-century view of unity, and to a certain degree, I think that was a little bit of a mirage in the sense that we were only measuring like-minded people.
Yes.
So when we think about some of the origin, one part of the origin of the political discord now is that more people have been granted greater access to constitutional protections.
Yeah.
And previously marginalized groups
see what you're
are
saying.
now starting to have. So when we start to think about how to increase virtue in our students, so we have to convince them that it's worthwhile to subordinate your own personal desires to the greater good. How do we do that when marginalized groups have so consistently been forced to the back? Right? They don't have. There's no incentive there.
Right.
So what do you think the next generation of teachers should do? And don't go into teaching, but what do you think? What do you think the next generation of teachers could do to promote the idea of virtue and convince more students that it was worth investing in?
I think that it starts with, involving yourself in local politics, and then it gets on a bigger scale to state politics, and then you have federal politics, and you eventually have international politics. And I think convincing people that when it works up to that level, that's when it's, starting in the local level and going up, that's how it becomes really important, because it eventually affects our whole nation.
Mhm.
And so I think, even as we see, the rise of global ascendancy of China and things like that in other nations, like being able to invoke that sense of like patriotism in people and like wanting to do better for their country is really important. Yes, Charlotte.
After all this research and this analyzation of political scandals, I think this might be a bad question. Do you still have faith in your government?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes.
Yay.
I've spent 9 months researching this topic, and I've come across some negative statistics, but ultimately I think that politicians are working to do better for their country. And I think that I think we do need more people in politics who are willing to represent minorities or constituencies who may not have as much say in politics. But I think ultimately, if we can restore virtue and democracy, which will be an uphill battle, but I think ultimately it's definitely a feasible thing. And I think if we can encourage people to get empowered in their communities, and then it works up to the federal level, I think that's how we can solve the problem.
Let's go back. Let's look at that. Steve, let's get a committee photo. Great audience, man. This has been an awesome group. My God. Well, no, I mean, like, good engagement from the audience. Here, and then we'll put them on that side. Make sure these slides.
Wait, me and you?
Yeah, and like three, that's talk King but we can't.
Okay, we have to all of each other.
Okay, King first.
Let's right up here, please. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, Mom, hold on.
Chris better.
Mom, you asked all my friends questions, we didn't ask any.
I have an alternate.
Without the split.
Yes.
Oh, we can do that.
1, 2, 3.
You look at the 4th of July.
You look like the 4th of July.
Makes you want a hot dog real bad. I know. It wasn't, but I remembered it as I was saying.
Oh, Maddie.
You should have got him an almond milk latte.
Hi, Mr. Thomas.
You did so good, Anna. Now you have to
We did so well.
It was my day. Anna knows about America.
Anna looks like
Anna actually murdered her. Anna is perfect.
I mean, you've done that for a fact.
It actually tasted very well.
GMD.
Oh my gosh, he was one like that. Good.
She basically like.
I remembered a lot more facts than I thought.
Crafted it for the life.
Yeah. I wanted to say.
It was all on. Well done.